Hello, and welcome to part 3 of urinary system anatomy. We are going to begin part 3 by talking about the nephron. And the nephron, of course, is the microscopic structural and functional unit of a kidney. In one kidney, we have approximately 1,000,000 nephrons. Now, the figure on the slide here demonstrates what one nephron looks like. Remember, they're microscopic. We have 1,000,000 of them in each kidney. And notice, this is the outside of the kidney, so this is your fibrous capsule. This outer side here is your cortex, and then as you go deeper into the kidney, this is your medulla. Remember, the medulla has the renal pyramids, and we talked about those at the end of the last lecture. So we'll talk about all of these parts, but notice there are small arteries in the renal cortex. You can see them here. They form tiny balls of capillaries called glomeruli. That's plural. So glomerulus is this tiny ball of capillaries right here. Blood is initially filtered through those glomeruli, and then it enters into that nephron system. So let's talk about the nephron in more detail. So notice the afferent arteriole supplies blood into the glomeruli. Remember, the glomeruli is that little ball of capillaries. Efferent arterioles take blood away, and then the efferent arterioles actually take blood away to a secondary capillary network that lives closer to these convoluted tubules. And we don't really need to know that, so don't worry about that. Just know that the efferent arterioles take blood away. Each glomerulus, again, the tiny ball of capillaries, is surrounded by a glomerular capsule. So that's what you see in green here, and that is also called Bowman's capsule. That is the proximal portion of each nephron, which collects the filtrate or the waste. The glomerular filtrate travels from the glomerular capsule to a proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, so in other words, the blood enters the glomerulus, is filtered through this glomerular capsule, and then goes into the proximal convoluted tubule. Okay, from the proximal convoluted tubule, it goes down the descending and then ascending loops of Henle to a distal convoluted tubule, which you see here, to a collecting tubule here, and then finally it enters into the minor calyx. Remember, the minor calyx join together to form a major calyx, and then they empty into the renal pelvis. The filtrate is termed urine by the time it reaches this minor calyx. Okay, so when it's passing through the nephron, we can call it filtrate. By the time it reaches the minor calyx, we can call it urine. Between the Bowman's capsule, again up here, and the minor calyces, more than 99% of the filtrate is reabsorbed into the kidney's venous system and then taken out via the renal veins into the inferior vena cava, recirculated in our body. So only 1% of that filtrate then is turned into waste or urine. Okay, so kind of interesting. Microscopically, the glomeruli, which remember is that little ball of capillaries, the glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule, and the proximal and distal convoluted tubules of the many nephrons we have in our kidney, those portions are all located within the cortex of the kidney. So imagine if I were to draw a line here. Okay, imagine this up here, all of this is cortex. Everything below the line lives in the medulla. Okay, the loop of Henle, the collecting tubules, again, those are all in the medulla of the kidney. So again, think about the renal pyramid. So these structures are living more in the renal pyramid. The renal pyramids, remember, within the medulla are primarily a collection of tubules, which we see here, which are helping to kind of collect and empty that urine or that filtrate into the minor calyx. Remember, the major calyces unite to form the renal pelvises, which then lead to the ureters. So it will be important that you are able to label the parts of a nephron. And really, it's just a system of tubes. And if you follow it, start at the afferent arteriole, you can kind of just follow the tube to understand the path of the filtrate. But I do want you to be able to label this, okay? All right. Let's talk about the ureters a little bit. The ureters transport urine from the kidneys down to the bladder, as we know. Slow peristaltic waves and gravity force the urine down the ureters into the bladder. The renal pelvis leaves each kidney at the region of the hilum and again becomes the ureter. The ureters vary in length from 28 to 34 centimeters approximately, with the right ureter being slightly shorter than the left. Again, probably because the right kidney sits a little bit lower in our abdomen. As the ureters pass downward or inferiorly, they lie on the anterior surface of each psoas muscle, and you can see that on the diagram here. Continuing to follow the curvature of the vertebral column, the ureters eventually enter the posterior and lateral portion of the bladder on each side. Okay, so posterior and lateral on each side of the bladder. The ureters vary in diameter from 1 millimeter to almost a centimeter. And there are 3 points in a ureter that are narrowed or constricted that you should be familiar with, because these are points where a kidney stone attempting to pass from the kidney to the bladder could get stuck. So the first constriction point I need you to know is the uretopelvic junction, and we abbreviate that UPJ. This is where the renal pelvis funnels down into that smaller ureter. So again, where the renal pelvis turns into the ureter, kidney stones can get stuck at that junction. So uretopelvic junction, or UPJ. The second is the brim of the pelvis, where the iliac blood vessels cross over the ureters. And you can kind of see that here. We don't see the iliac blood vessels on this diagram, but where they cross over the ureters, that is a point of constriction. And then the third would be the area where the ureter joins the bladder, and that is known as the uretrovesical junction, or UVJ. And most kidney stones that pass down the ureter tend to hang up at this third site, this UVJ. And I want to be clear, many kidney stones get stuck at the UPJ. But what Bontrager is trying to say is that if the kidney stone passes the UPJ and the pelvic brim, they tend to get caught up at the UVJ down here at the bladder. Once the stone passes the UVJ and moves into the bladder, it generally has little trouble passing from the bladder through the urethra and to the outside of the body. Now, if you've ever had kidney stones, or if you know anyone that has, you know they are very painful. And to be clear, kidney stones in and of themselves tend not to be painful. It's when they try to move through that skinny little ureter that they cause patients so much pain. They're really tiny little jagged rocks, and you can imagine why that would be painful passing through your ureter. All right, let's talk a little bit about the bladder. The bladder is a muscular membranous sac that serves as a reservoir for urine. The empty bladder is somewhat flattened and kind of assumes more of an oval shape only when it's partially or fully distended or full of urine. Notice this triangular portion of the bladder along the inner posterior surface. That is called the trigone. The trigone is the muscular area formed by the entrances of the 2 ureters from behind or posteriorly and the exit site of the urethra. In other words, it's where everything's coming and going in the bladder. Okay, so it kind of makes sense that it's kind of a more durable, tough area. Notice the trigon is smooth, whereas the remaining aspect of the inner bladder has numerous folds, and guess what? Those folds are called rugae, just like in the stomach, remember? As the bladder fills, the top of the bladder expands upward and forward towards the abdominal cavity. In the male anatomy, the gland that surrounds the proximal urethra is called the prostate gland. It is situated below the bladder and measures 1.5 inches in diameter by about 1 inch in height. The prostate functions to make a fluid that improves the movement of sperm during reproduction. And please note that the male and female bladders are very similar internally. The male bladder was important here because I wanted to point out the prostate gland. This is an image taken during an IVU exam. And an IVU is an exam in which we administer contrast into a patient's bloodstream and then take radiographs as the kidneys filter the blood and waste, and the waste is then passed down into the bladder. So you can see the white here, this is all contrast in the urine. And of course, we'll talk about this exam more in lab. Okay, so we're going to pause part 3 here. We'll pick up part 4 discussing bladder function.